Hello, Gaku here. I figured it was time for me to give my thoughts on the release version of Victoria 3. I've got about a dozen disclaimers before I get to my thoughts, so let's get through those first. I've been playing for about 71 hours at this point according to Steam. That includes about a dozen test campaigns where I just loaded up, tried something very briefly to see how it worked, and then restarted. After the test games, I played 3 full campaigns. The first 2 campaigns were as Hungary, because of course they were. And after that I decided to go for the Mexico achievement, so the third was as Mexico. So most of the things that I'll be talking about, I'll be using examples from these 3 campaigns, with the exception of the second Hungary campaign, because unfortunately, if you play a campaign all the way through to 1936, and then you try and load it, you end up at the game over screen, so there's not a lot I can show you here. But this was super informative. I used the information that I learned in the first Hungary campaign to really improve things in this one. Then after that I decided to move to the Mexico campaign, which I'll be using extensively for examples. So as far as the release version, that's been my experience. I didn't get a pre-release influencer version from Paradox, nor did I ask for one. I did, however, play the leak version earlier this year, so I wasn't completely new to how the economy worked. But anyway, I paid my $80 for the Super Mega Ultra Deluxe pre-release version on Steam, and the vast majority of my experience with Victoria 3 has been after release. Now, if you caught my stream, then you got my first impressions of things as I encountered them. But since that time, I played 2 additional campaigns, and I've had a lot of time to think about things. So first impressions are important. I'll be going way deeper than just the first impressions. Also, to get a sense of what people were saying about this game, I read through a number of professional reviews on gaming websites. I read through a bunch of Steam reviews, and then I also watched probably half a dozen different reviews that people had put up on YouTube. I think I can safely say that absolutely no one shares my opinions on this game, so what you're going to hear in this video is very different from what you probably heard from other people, probably different from what you're going to expect to hear from me as we go forward. About 3 years ago, I made a YouTube video about how I would design Victoria 3. This was well before Victoria 3 was announced, but I went through basically point by point of things that I would change and improve from Victoria 2 and what my design priorities would be in making Victoria 3. And I have to say I'm shocked at just how many of my recommendations made it into the game. Some of these were not obvious, but I will be talking about them and why they're important and what it can mean going forward. The last thing before I get to specific examples, I've read a ton of complaints about this game. And I want to address one class of complaints now before we get to specific game issues. There are a lot of complaints regarding lack of flavor, lack of differentiation. There are important features from Victoria 2 that aren't present in Victoria 3. Now, when it comes to the lack of polish, the lack of differentiation, the lack of flavor, this is not something that I'm personally concerned with. Everyone knows that mods are going to handle a big portion of this, and the real question is, does the game provide the capabilities to make those distinctions? Now, in some cases the answer is no, because for example there is no westernization system right now. But we can assume going forward that one will be added, so this is not the sort of thing that I'm personally concerned with. I know that there are a lot of very obvious problems with this game, and a lot of people have pointed out these obvious problems. But because they're obvious, I'm assuming that they will be addressed going forward. Paradox releases games that many people consider to be unfinished. That's a perfectly legitimate complaint, and I'm not going to tell you otherwise, but for me personally, knowing Paradox's long-established history at this point of releasing games that need a lot of work and then improving them over time, this is not a surprise to me, and it's not something that I'm too concerned about, because I can assume that it will continue to be improved. And this is also why I'm not concerned with the obvious problems, because obvious problems have obvious solutions, and we can assume that they're already being worked on now. So that's it for the disclaimers. I'll be using my experiences and what I've learned about Victoria 3 to talk about specific game aspects, including things I like, things I don't like, the logic behind them, and especially what it could mean in terms of development going forward. And in some cases I'll be giving specific recommendations of things that could be changed. Let's start with the elephant in the room, which is the war and combat system. This is one of the major things that people have complaints about. But before we talk about these specific problems, let's identify what this system is. First, you'll notice that there are 2 fronts between the US and Mexico. This tiny border between Indian Territory and Mexico is considered one front, and then the entire rest of the border between the US and Mexico, including both sides of this tiny front, this is all considered one front. So why is this important? It's because if you have regions that are not contiguous, that's where the fronts split. This is not something that I can demonstrate intentionally in this game, because obviously you have no control over fronts. But imagine a situation where the US front extends down to the Gulf of California, And then so this part of Mexico is no longer contiguous with this part of Mexico, and then this splits off into a separate front from this one, in which case we'd have 3 different fronts. And this is why fronts split and reorganize in really bizarre ways, because anytime you have a region that isn't contiguous, it creates a new front. But what is the actual system being used here to generate fronts? Believe it or not, this is actually a variation of the Hoi 4 front system. Imagine this same exact situation in Hoi 4, where you create a spearhead to push down to the Gulf of California. What happens in Hoi 4? The fronts reorganize in unpredictable and often useless ways. But because you're a player and because you know this is happening, you can pause the game, stop your units from reorganizing themselves in really idiotic ways. You can manually reset the fronts yourself. But in Victoria 3, you can't manually control your units, so when the fronts reorganize, you have 0 control over what your units are going to do over those new fronts. Now another problem here is that in Hoi 4, you can stop your units from moving, and they will stay in place. But in Victoria 3, your units can teleport from front to front. So oftentimes they'll teleport to a front that is not the front you want them to be on. This of course can create a lot of problems and frustration. And on the other side, if you want to, you can completely abuse it against the AI that has absolutely no idea what to do. This is an example of something that I recommended that wasn't implemented in quite the way that I would have done it myself. That's because when I said fronts should be automated to some extent also includes the fullest extent, which is actually what we got. When you're on the offensive, if you win, then you can take large chunks of land. When you're on the offensive and you lose, you either lose nothing or you lose a single province. But if you're defending, the best you can do is gain a single province back if you're defending in home territory. So it would seem to be that the best thing to do is to always attack. But the downside is that if you're on the offensive, then you're going to take heavier losses on average because of defensive bonuses. So it's not 100%, but if you do have the numerical advantages, you want to always be attacking. Another thing we have to talk about here is a very controversial game aspect, which is that along each of the fronts, only a single battle can occur at one time. So the progress bar has to fill up, and then once it fills up, the battle starts, but it's only one battle across this entire front. And then after that battle ends, the progress bar fills up again, and then the next battle starts. I'm not 100% sure what the influence was for this progress bar, but I'm reminded of the active time battle system from, I think, Final Fantasy 3-6. While you're taking an action or while you're attacking, everyone's progress bar stops, but then when nothing is happening, that's when the progress bars fill up. And some bars fill up slower than others, and we see that there are different modifiers that go into determining how quickly they fill up. But regardless of how quickly this fills up, you can only ever have one battle at a time. I'm not going to load my Mexico campaign, but I want to describe the situation for you. My border with the US at the time when I was playing Mexico went something like this. Was down, they had Arizona, I had New Mexico, I had a tiny bit of Colorado, this massive border, they had Texas, and so the border was gigantic. But along this entire border, you could only have one battle at a time. I started the war, I think it was 1890 or so, it took forever to build up to that point. By the 1880s, I had surpassed the US in population and GDP, but with no real ability to train or maintain units, I had to wait a lot longer to go to war. And that's when I started really expanding down into South America to try and get resources to fund the war effort. So about 1890, I declared war. And at the time I declared war, I had a much better military than the US. It was a larger military, better equipped, better tech, better everything. But with this massive front, I basically just had to sit and wait. Bars take time to fill up, and then the battles can take a very long time. We'll talk about that in a minute. Because fronts are so huge, and because you're only taking a finite number of provinces, even if you win the battle, if you lose the battle, it's a difference of 1 province. But if you win the battle, you might get 20 or so. But even so, this is a tiny chunk of Mexico here. Let's see how long it takes for battle from start to finish. So February 26th, this is halfway through the progress bar. We'll just run it and see how long it takes. Alright, so battle's over. Now we're halfway through the progress bar. So it was almost 20 days, and that was a very quick and easy battle that the US won. Now you can imagine if this battle had taken longer, this would have been an even slower turnaround. So a very quick turnaround on a single battle was about 20 days. And of course I'm playing an AI Mexico that is not at all optimized for wars, so the US is probably going to steamroll me. But even so, it's a very, very slow steamrolling. When I had this massive front with the US and I was at war, I was making gains, but the gains were so incredibly slow that the front basically hadn't moved in 4 years. Slow back and forth. They pushed into California, I pushed everywhere else. but overall nothing had really changed in 4 years. Now 1890, probably thinking this is close to the era of trench warfare, but I'm pretty sure that neither one of us had unlocked trench infantry yet. Trench infantry does decrease the amount of provinces captured or lost. I'm pretty sure we were still using skirmish infantry at the time, so I don't think that was the issue. The real issue was just that battles took forever, because you only get one battle at a time along this massive front. Now, something else I want to point out is that there does seem to be some manner of tracking the number of troops on the front, even if they aren't being shown to you. As I was playing Mexico, one of my top immigrant destinations was California, so the population of California was huge. Now, elsewhere along this border, the population was not so high. So what I noticed is that as our troops were fighting in California, the number of battalions facing off against each other was a lot higher as a proportion than they were anywhere else along the front. So over here it might be like 2v2, 3v3, 4v4, something like that. Over here it's like 40 versus 40, 50 versus 50, which is a huge difference from what you see everywhere else on the front. So the game is absolutely tracking in some way the number of troops that are being distributed along the front, even if you can't see them. Now, I don't know if it's doing it in real time or if it's just a proportional thing, but the game is absolutely tracking it, even if you can't see it. Now let's consider an individual battle. So let this progress bar fill up, where the battle starts over here. Looks like I'm losing this battle, but what do we see? Representation of the two different armies. We have a randomly rolled combat modifier, one for each side. This is the sort of CK2/Hoy influence, which I'm perfectly fine with. But what we notice is that this does not change throughout the course of battle. So if you have 20% morale damage, you get this 20% morale damage for the entire battle. And if you happen to get a bad roll, you get that bad roll for the entire battle. Here at the bottom we have the effects of commander traits. We have the contribution of the individual troops, plus we have commander traits. There's a representation of the current number of battalions currently defending or attacking. We see the dead and wounded, and down at the bottom we see a representation of all the different battalions currently engaged. Now, there isn't a whole lot of information being shown here about what the battalions are doing, but what we do see is the morale of each of these battalions. This is a huge departure from the Victoria II line battle system, and I'll point out that I made a very specific recommendation in designing Victoria 3. That I said the line battle system from Victoria 2 does not make sense in the area of trench warfare, and something needs to change. I said I did not know what needed to change, but my recommendation was that if you had to take a single system and apply it to all of Victoria 3, you apply the Victoria 1 system. And what is this system? This is what we see in Victoria 1. We have the attacking commander and the defending commander. We can see their stats, and because neither one of us has a commander, the stats are terrible. We have the number of divisions on each side, or battalions in the case of Victoria 3. We have the total morale on each side represented by the green bar. In the case of Vic 1, we have the total strength of each side as well. But down at the bottom, we have a representation of every single unit. You don't have to scroll quite so far in Victoria 1, but this is essentially the same information. Also in Victoria 1, you see the total strength of the individual divisions that are taking part in the battle. You see the total strength, you see the morale individually, and at the bottom you see combat modifiers. Of course, you can't have a flanking bonus if you can't flank, so this is a bit of a problem in current Vic 3. But there are other things here listed, like the effect of railroads, there's dig-in, there's a fortress, there's artillery on both sides. These are support units in Victoria 1, not individual cannon brigades as they are in Victoria 2. And so this is also very similar to the way it works in Victoria 1. Something else where they also seem to have taken inspiration from Vic 1 is just the insane number of windows you have to click through to find anything. But, you know, that's something that I assume will be fixed later because it's so incredibly obvious. But what I want to focus on here before we talk about anything else is that what we have in Vic 3 is in fact the Vic 1 system. So my recommendation was that if I were to take a single system and apply it to Vic 3, I would use the Vic 1 system and then tweak it from there. And they have in fact used the Vic 1 system. Of course, in Vic 1 you aren't limited to just a single battle on a front, so that's a major difference. But when it comes to the actual combat that's taking place, this is the Vic 1 system. We do have combat modifiers in Victoria 3, but they're not obvious. You have to go to the Details tab, and this is where you see things like Defense in Forested Terrain, Defense in Elevated Terrain, Casualties Taken modifiers, all these different modifiers, but they're not obvious on the overviews. So in the overview, this is the trimmed down version that we saw in Victoria 1, and then in the details, this is where it's showing you all the combat modifiers. So there are combat modifiers, even if they aren't obvious, so bravo on that. So I'm going to set this general to now advance on this front. Of course, we have to wait for the progress bar to fill up. This battle is taking place, the progress bar stops. Again, it's the active time battle system from Final Fantasy VI. Alright, here we go. So my attack went through, and this attack just started, but we're now suiciding into the United States. This battle just started. Low morale battalions, suiciding. We've got lower numbers. There's nothing about this battle that makes any sense. And despite the US having poor visibility and minus 25% on offense and defense, this is still an obvious loss. This is, I think, one of the most frustrating things about the system, and it's that there's zero player agency. If this were a much larger battle, if it were 30 units versus 40 units, and it's an obvious loss, at that point, if it were a game like Hoi or Victoria 2, I could go in and manually retreat my units, but in this game that's not possible because the battle is going to play out until it's completely over. So one side is going to lose or the other side is going to lose, but there's no retreating, there's no player agency in this battle at all. So if I run it, of course this is going to be a loss. The system forces you to take higher losses than you normally would because it attacks in ways that make zero sense. But this is also something that we've seen somewhere else. Think back to the very first time you ever played Hearts of Iron, and this is especially if you didn't watch someone stream it, or if you just hopped into the game, loaded it up, and played it like I did. What was the very first thing you did? You probably assigned some troops to a front and then told them to attack, and then what happened? They just instantly suicided into the enemy. And that's because if you're using a normal attack, then your troops don't really care if they can win or not, they simply care whether you have morale or not. And that's exactly what's happening here. So your troops determine they can attack, and so they do, and with no regard for whether they can win or not, they simply suicide into the enemy. This is exactly what happens in Hoi 4 if you're not using careful attacks and if you're not micromanaging your own units. I'm really not surprised that this is happening here, but it is incredibly frustrating when it does, especially because you have this long front, battles take a long time, you only get one battle at a time, and then on top of that your units are just suiciding in ways that is completely maddening. Taking all that together, what are the actual problems here? Is the problem the VIC-1 combat system? I don't think so. Is the problem the lines themselves? I don't think so. What is the problem? Well, number one, it's the lack of agency. So things you can do in Victoria 2, like cycling troops, reinforcing, retreating, these are all impossible in this. I know that might be part of the design philosophy, but just having to watch your unit suicide over and over into the enemy is really frustrating gameplay. So I don't think that is good. Now, if there were some extra buttons here where you could somehow influence the battles, that would certainly make a huge difference. Even just being able to manually re-roll your maneuvers would be huge. I don't understand why we can't reinforce. This seems like a no-brainer. Your different armies that are assigned to a front have no real interaction with each other, so this is a major problem. They don't appear to be distributing themselves along the front, and you'll know that because if you have, let's say, 200 units assigned to this front, and the enemy only has 100, you aren't outnumbering them 2 to 1. So the fact that you outnumber the enemy has zero impact because only one army is ever attacking or defending at a time. No interactions between armies, having no ability to have any impact on a battle in progress whatsoever. Attacking, retreating, nothing. This is a major problem in my opinion. My examples for how this system could work were VIC-1 and Hoi, and in both of those systems the player has agency. How to resolve this problem right now, I'm not sure. But I think that is the main problem, is simply the lack of agency. But when it comes to the lack of agency, I think one of the bigger problems is that your armies are assigned by HQ. So as an example, if you need a few extra troops down here, you can't simply send a few battalions over to this HQ. You can't transfer between your HQs. And this is also a major problem in how playing as Mexico was finally able to beat the US. Because we had this massive front that hadn't moved in 4 years. But what I realized is that the AI really doesn't know how to manage its navies, so I built just a few man-o'-wars, and with a few man-o'-wars I was able to start naval invasions all across the US. And once you have a naval invasion taking place, this is a new front, and so each new front requires an entire army. As Mexico, I reorganized my armies. Instead of assigning all of my units to major generals, which basically puts all of your battalions under one general, I had a few major generals with large stacks, and then everyone else was in like 20 stacks. And so my 20 stacks could hold these tiny fronts and push them. In contrast, the US had all of its battalions in these massive armies, and so it could only ever hold 3 or 4 fronts at a time. So I was pushing 6 or 7, and it could hold 3 or 4. And there was absolutely no way the US could split off troops to defend those other fronts. And so pushing from all directions, that's how I beat the US. The AI hasn't realized that it has this capability, because even if you're fighting a nation like the UK tends to not launch naval invasions, even though if they were to do so, they could completely overwhelm your defenses just by virtue of not leaving you with any spare armies to defend against the new fronts. Because the AI can't split off its units, it means that you as a player can take advantage and open new fronts in a way that is really unfair and gamey, it's sad to say. It's the same way I beat Russia in one of my Hungary campaigns. Russia, with its strong military, we've got this tiny border, and even as I'm pushing, it's taking forever, it's taking forever, it's taking forever, it's taking forever. So what do I do instead? Naval invasion, naval invasion, naval invasion, naval invasion, naval invasion, naval invasions all over Russia, pushing all these tiny little fronts all over the place, and then Russia got completely overwhelmed. That's how I beat the US, that's how I beat Russia, that's how you can beat practically any major power, because the major powers put all their eggs in one basket, and so they can't deal with these tiny invasions. So that's not a good system in my opinion. How to best resolve this particular problem, which is the lack of agency? Well, obviously you have to be able to interact with the battle in some way. Even just giving a retreat button, this is the simplest and most important thing that needs to be added here is a retreat button, because simply suiciding into the enemy with no ability to withdraw, this is a major problem. But you know, there are other things that need to be included here, and that's assuming you aren't giving players direct control over their battalions like you had before. Now, personally, I would love to individually control my battalions because I like micromanaging wars. Now, I don't like micromanaging unimportant fronts. That's one downside of Victoria 2. But when it comes to the individual battles and the tactics involved, this is one of the most engaging things about Victoria 2, especially in multiplayer. And so here, it's completely gone. So I guess the take home here, my recommendation, you have to add back some level of agency. And you can start with really simple stuff like manually being able to tell your units to retreat. But personally, I would like to be able to micromanage my battalions if I want to. I thought that in designing Vic 3, I made it clear that you should be able to micromanage your units if you want to. Maybe that part got lost in the shuffle, I don't know. This combat system, such as it is, this is fine, but it's slow. And slow would be fine if it weren't just a single battle along the front. If there were multiple battles, this would be fine. But because it's just one battle across the entire front, this is excruciating. And it's even more excruciating when you're suiciding into the enemy and you have to just sit there and watch while this is happening and you waste your time. This is obviously one of the major complaints that people have about the game. Of course, I would encourage Paradox to reevaluate this decision because it greatly hinders the potential for meaningful multiplayer. So this is the main thing I want to talk about when it comes to the war and combat system, is the lack of agency, because all of the other problems stem from that. I am concerned at this point that the backlash against this system has been so massive that they will completely throw it out and get rid of the useful parts, which I do think that the Vic 1 system with its modifiers is the better system, much better than the line battles we had in Vic 2. This I would like to keep, but the line needs a lot of work. After player agency is added, and especially if players can manage individual parts of a front or units along a front, then that solves a lot of problems, including the problem of your units teleporting back and forth. So giving the players that ability to manage their units solves a lot of problems. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, is that I am unfortunately very disappointed in this combat system. I'm even more disappointed because they quite literally added everything that I asked for, but in the process they removed the player agency, which is probably the absolute most important thing about Victoria. I guess I owe people an apology for making this recommendation, but it didn't quite go the way I would have anticipated, I would say. But at the bare minimum, adding some level of player agency is essential at this point, because this system is just not going to work. This is an unscripted video, and I will be editing it, but I don't have a specific list of things to talk about, but I will be just going down a list of things that come to mind and I think are important. And I guess the next thing is probably the HQ system, because this also relates to the way the wars are fought. The mobilization system I like. The conscript system is fantastic because You don't have to micromanage your units moving all across the place, but of course you can't micromanage any of your units at all, so that's bad. But as far as the ability to automatically apply your conscripts to armies, that is fantastic. And also the ability to change the way that your different troops are kitted out. Now, a lot of people have complaints about this system, and especially how it's not really balanced, because each unit type is just an objective improvement over the next one, with the exception of the specialist companies. But that's fine in its current state. The thing that I'm more concerned with is that if you want, this is very tedious, but you can do it, you can, on an individual army basis, get them out however you want. So if you want one army to be nothing but flamethrowers, you can go through and set all of them to flamethrowers. You have to click every single battalion to do this, so it's incredibly tedious, but you can do it. This is something that I really like. It's not handled well in the UI, but just the fact that you can do this is pretty amazing. And assuming we do get differentiation between different unit and support types, not just like the flat increase, so 10-15 becomes 20-30 becomes 30-35, right? So the only difference is the increased goods consumption along the way. But if we get like actual pros and cons of different types of units, and then we can mix and match them within armies, this is in fact a great system. As it is right now, it's okay, but just the fact that this exists means that it can be improved on later. So I really like this system. It's cumbersome, it's clunky, but just the fact that it exists is great. Why else is this important? I mentioned I played Hungary and I played Mexico, and neither Hungary nor Mexico are resource-rich nations. They have certain resources in abundance, and then other super important ones they don't have at all. If you're playing the US or the UK or France or some major colonial power, then maybe you can go through and use the absolute most expensive one of these every single time. Maybe you're going through and automatically upgrading your factories to the max level. We're going to talk about that too. But if you are resource starved, then maybe you don't have the option of using these higher tiers of units. So let's use an example here. Skirmish infantry, 30 offense, 35 defense. But we get an additional plus 25 defense if we go to trench infantry. If we compare 30 offense to 40 offense, this is only plus 10. So skirmish infantry is fine on the offense, but trench infantry is amazing on the defense. So if you happen to have a general with great defensive traits, and then you happen to not have a lot of resources and money, you can set just this guy's units to trench infantry and leave everyone else's skirmish infantry. And this is the sort of thing that I was doing in my playthrough. If you are playing a resource-starved nation, then the ability to not waste your resources in places you don't want to waste them is a huge improvement. This system at its core I really like. It's a type of division designer, and what you get right now are trade-offs in power versus resource consumption. If we expand this out further, then we can have pros and cons in other ways. So, spec for offense, spec for defense, spec for reconnaissance. Already you can spec for reconnaissance, but they're just flat upgrades. So this is not exactly what I'm looking at, but maybe you have a spec for offensive recon and a spec for defensive recon. But this is the sort of thing that I can assume will be added later because the system is already in place. It's clunky, but it works. Something that I don't like as much is the HQ system. So rather than being able to move your battalions between your armies, your battalions, number one, once they're in an army, they can never leave that army unless you retire the general, so that's a problem. But also, if you have just a single unit way off in the middle of nowhere on some treaty port, you can't ever merge that into a larger army, so it just becomes a sort of useless single stack off in the middle of nowhere. Maybe that's intentional, but personally, I would really like to have the control over the individual battalions. Now, my recommendation in designing Victoria 3 was to not tie soldiers to provinces, which is in fact the exact opposite of what they did. Because the way that you produce a standing army in Vic 3 is to build barracks, and then your barracks, of course, are in a particular state, and then the barracks in that state produce units that then apply to that HQ. So this is just an additional level of complication that I don't think is particularly useful. Let's take this barracks in Mexico, and it's supporting 3 battalions. And so if I were to change this to irregular infantry, watch what happens under the military tab. You have to track down your army representing that HQ, which is here, and then you have to find the regular troops from that particular state, which is here. But what happens if you have a larger state, you have multiple armies for HQ? So as an example, in my Mexico game, I built a massive army because I had to. I was fighting the US. And so most of my troops, reasonably, are coming from the Mexico HQ. And so Mexico HQ had probably 2 or 3 different armies that were very large. If you go into your barracks and you try and spec out, let's say, the Mexico barracks, and you want to set this to regular infantry, then if you look under military, you find the armies that come from that barracks, then you see that they change too. You can change the way they're kitted out either in the army itself, or you can go in the buildings, development, barracks. You can do it either way. But the problem is, if you have a lot of battalions split across multiple armies, then you can't really kit them out in a meaningful way, because if you change the organization for multiple units, and those units are spread across multiple armies, then you have to kit out those armies in the same way. But let's say you want an army of exactly 4 battalions, right? So if I want the Texas units as regular infantry, and if I want the Yucatan units as regular infantry, and if I only want these 4 units in an army, I can't do that. And it's because you have no control over the way that your armies are distributed. And so this is one of the downsides of having no control over your individual battalions, but it's also a downside of the fact that your individual battalions are directly tied to the production methods and the maintenance methods that apply to the individual barracks. That's why I said that I don't like tying units to provinces, because this is the sort of problem that emerges, and especially when you have this super rigid system where you can never take, let's say, a Dixie unit and add him to the Central American Army. So this is a major problem, and it's something that I think needs to be fixed. Again, it removes player agency. You should be able to split up your army in any number of ways, the same way you can in Vic, the same way you can in Hoy, the same way you can in Eve 4. And even if we are going to continue to tie units to HQs, there's no reason that we shouldn't have, let's say, 2 Mexico HQs, and I can swap units between them, because then at least I can figure out which units I want to put where, even if they happen to be from the same HQ. But right now you can't do that either. This might not be a problem that you've encountered, but if you are trying to spec out your units, and if you, especially if you're playing as a less developed nation or a resource poor nation, then this can be a major problem. Oddly enough, the naval systems are somewhat more developed than the land combat systems. This was a pleasant surprise, because when I first loaded up the game, I assumed that because land combat was so hands-off, the naval system would be as well. But actually, there's quite a bit more that you can do with the naval system, depending on how much micro you're willing to do. And I'm not concerned with that right now. What I'm concerned with is that you have the exact same problems with assigning ships to fleets that you have with assigning armies to HQs. Your fleets are assigned to naval bases are assigned to states, and states are assigned to HQs. So same sort of problem. If, for example, you want to merge all of your navies into one massive fleet to go attack an enemy fleet, you know, obviously there are limits on what you can do, but even if you wanted to do that, you can't, because you can't merge the fleets from these different HQs. The probably unintended benefit of this is that because you can only promote an admiral to level 5, there is a cap on the number of ships that an admiral can control, which means that even the UK with its massive fleet has a cap on how many ships it can bring to a battle. So if you have one super high level admiral with a ton of ships, you can potentially have a more devastating navy than even a country like the UK, because the UK can't bring all of its naval firepower to bear against you at one time, because it has to split them among all of its different admirals. And let's take a look at the UK just for example. There we see the UK has 5 fleets, and this was just the AI. We have one major fleet of 100 ships, but the next one is 35. If Victoria 2, would you ever split off a third of your fleet to make a separate fleet? I guess you could, but that's really if you just wanted those ships to get destroyed by someone else, because the more ships you bring to a naval battle, the better your chances are. But here we see there's a practical limit. We have a tier 5 Grand Admiral, and so this guy is completely maxed out. He can never control more than 100 ships. If the US pumps out a ton of naval bases, it can produce a fleet exactly the same size as the UK, admiral modifiers notwithstanding. I think this is also a problem, and why I don't think that any of your military should be tied directly to provinces when it comes to assigning units. If the levels of your naval bases are going to be 100% responsible for determining both your naval force limit and the size of your navy, that's fine. There's still no reason to force players to tie their fleets to the HQs. So this again is something where I think we could use some changes. I don't have a strong opinion on the different options listed here because the only ones that I've ever really used are naval invasions and patrol coast. Raiding convoys, I haven't had much luck with that. I don't know if it's just because the nations that I fought didn't really have convoys, and for escorting convoys this would seem to be more important, but I don't have any real amount of experience with it, so I'm not going to comment on it. I will say that there are certainly more options that can be included here. Of course, adding any additional amount of player agency that you can add to the naval system, I would say, would be an improvement. As with the army system, your navies seem to teleport between regions, so I think that can be improved on. But I think the more important thing and the more pressing issue is the HQ restriction. I think that needs to be done away with. In designing Vic 3, I used the example of individual military techs unlocking upgrades to units, and if you look at many of them, they in fact do. The different options that you have for kitting out your militaries, most of these options are unlocked by specific techs in the technology tree under the military tab. And in designing Vic 3, I mentioned that having something like this apply also to the other branches of technology would be really cool. It's just up to the imagination of the people designing the system. And if you look under production, this is exactly what they did. All of the different production building upgrades are contained within the different technologies here. Just at a glance, the vast majority of these technologies unlock something that you can then apply to your buildings. And in the society tree, a lot of the technologies unlock specific laws and things that are really useful. So these aren't the plus 2% and plus 5% bonuses that you saw in the invention spam in Victoria 2. Most of the technologies are useful in their own way. So the system that we started with, I think it's great because it has a real impact on the way that you play the game. Whether that's unlocking laws or unlocking production methods, there's actual incentives to use different technologies. Especially when you get a pop-up about a tech that you have researched, it tends to be something that's very important to you in at least the short term. Let's go over to buildings. So we have the base production method, which is just a raw increase in the total number of goods produced. The higher you go in the base production methods, the inputs can be incredibly expensive, especially if we're considering higher value resources like electricity, dyes, sulfur, that sort of thing. So basically the inputs get a lot more expensive, but the factories also become way more efficient. Next we have the luxury production method. It's how you get your higher valuable items, but the inputs for luxury items tend to be way more expensive. So we're talking silk, rubber, oil, that sort of thing, dyes, all these super expensive stuff that a lot of nations just don't have any access to whatsoever. The next major column is automation, which frees up your pops, but also costs a substantial amount in resources. You can make your factories more efficient in terms of outputs per unit input, because remember, the pops themselves require inputs. This also applies to your RGOs. Things like mining equipment and explosives determine the total amount of a resource that can be produced. You're going to be paying more in inputs, whether that's tool, coal, oil, and especially dynamite in the case of explosives. So this can get very expensive, but the returns can be worth it depending on what you're doing. We have steam automation, which requires coal and engines, which themselves can be very expensive, but this frees up a lot of your pops to do other things. We have train automation. Assuming you're already building railroads in your nation, to deal with the fact that you have limited market access, then you use the excess transportation to free up laborers in your RGOs. And of course there are other equivalent things for the more agricultural aspects. So how much fertilizer are you using? Are you supplying them with rail or not? How much automation are you using in logging? All these different things. It's really cool, but it is a lot to deal with. The game indicates when you have a new production method available, but it doesn't necessarily tell you which one's going to be most useful for you at any given time. For example, as the US right now, I have a small shortage in explosives. So when the game indicates I have a new production method, and if you just go in and click it, you're going to add to the deficit in your explosives in this case. And you can see the substitution cost is actually going to cost me money, and it's not going to be the most useful upgrade, but this is available. If you're not paying attention and you're going through and automatically upgrading everything to the highest level, watch what this does to the deficit. So we went from a deficit of about 112, I think, to 746. So now this is a massive shortage, and it's now such a shortage that it's impacting the efficiency of the RGOs because there isn't enough explosives to go around. You have to be mindful of this as you're upgrading your production methods, because simply going to the most efficient one possible isn't necessarily the best option, because you might not have the resources necessary to maintain the factories or the RGOs. Now dropped to 290, but we still have a shortage. Of course, you can manage this RGO type by RGO type, but even so, this is very micromanagement intensive. And what I do is actually I go through on an RGO by RGO basis. So I'm opening the coal mines, and now I'm upgrading just the exact number dynamite that my economy can handle. And because coal is an input for everything else, this tends to be the one that I focus on. But as an example, let's run the clock for a week, because now there's a surplus of 137 units. If you want to be super efficient, you can go through and set exactly 137 units worth of production to change to explosives. So there's 50, add 60, that's 110, and that's going to be 210. That's too much, so we can't convert this one. But we'll convert that one, and maybe one more just for good measure. We'll see what that does, and then run the clock for 1 week. Everything updates, you resort, and then we take a look, and now we've got a deficit of only 24 explosives. You can spend a lot of time micromanaging the exact production methods for your different RGOs and factories. And if you do this, you prevent yourself from running into these massive deficits because you're only using the resources that you have available, so you're not allowing these massive deficits to accrue. I have a deficit of 705 tools, and of course I can build new tool factories, but maybe I'm building other more important things right now and I don't want to do that. So I have to go through now and find where I'm wasting all these tools and try to fix the problem. This is the game at this point, at least as far as how I play it. If you're trying to make your industry as efficient as possible, then my gameplay loop looks something like this. Run the clock for a week, check the markets, sort to see where the imbalances are, check the constructions, see if the constructions are addressing the deficits, and see how constructions need to be modified, and then after that run it for a week, check the deficits again. Some of your deficits can be overcome with trade routes, but this depends on if you have access and if the goods are available. So right now I can get 675 tools from the French market, which happens to be pretty close to the entire deficit. But there's no guarantee that France is going to have 700 tools available. You have to assume you're going to be self-sufficient, and especially if you don't have access to particular markets. Let's take a look at glass. I have a deficit in glass, but look at what's available. There's no glass available in the markets that I have access to. This is something where I'm just out of luck. There's a tiny bit of paper available in France, a bit more tobacco available, but it's spread around. And let's look at liquor. There's essentially no liquor available. And remember, anytime you set up a trade route, this is going to cost bureaucracy. So you can, if you want, queue up every single one of these trade routes for the tiny amount of liquor that's available, but in doing so, you're going to tank your bureaucracy. And personally, I try to only import in cases where I can import a substantial amount that will actually cover demand. There's quite a bit of micro that's required to do all of this. And then if you consider unproductive trade routes, you have to deal with those, like do I want to import iron at a loss, because it's more important to import the iron than it is to lose the money. So now I have to check and see, what is my situation with iron? Is it because I actually have the iron, which I do? Now I have to go back and remove it. And that is just because a trade route is unproductive doesn't mean that it's not important. So if we go back and look, so we got clothing. So the clothing route is not productive, but I absolutely need clothing. So this is not one that I'm going to get rid of, but just glancing at it, I don't know that. I'm going to maintain this route even though it's costing me money, because I'd rather have the clothes than have a tiny bit more money. And of course, if you're looking through the individual goods, this is very tedious trying to get through these different menus. There's a lot of scrolling. It's carpal tunnel city. But what you can do if you're willing to micromanage to this level is quite incredible. As an example, as it is right now, this trade network is amazing for the US because we're making money by importing from the UK, and we're also making money by exporting to both Mexico and France. So this is really cool. This is the sort of example that I used in the Brazilian coal monopoly in my Designing Vic 3 video. This is really cool that you can do this. This isn't even something that I had to set up myself. So I set the imports because I needed the grain, and then the AIs decided to import the excess. So that's amazing. But if any part of this trade network breaks down, I might have a problem. What is the core reason for this potential problem? The Victoria 3 market system on its own is incredible, but it has to update every single month because there are no stockpiles. This means if you have a shortage of anything, the effect is immediate and potentially devastating. Alright, loaded up my Mexico campaign. Probably some massive deficits. Alright, here we go. I'm importing a ton of fabric from Russia and the UK. Almost 8,000 units each, about 15,000 units total. I have a surplus of 5,000 fabric. But if I happen to go to war with either the UK or Russia, then I'm going to go from a surplus of 5,000 to a deficit of 2,500 immediately. If either of these nations suddenly lose their access to the surplus fabric, all of this import just goes away. What am I using fabric for? Got pop needs, textile mills, construction sector, shipyards, barracks, furniture manufacturers. So I've got a ton of things that rely on this fabric. If from one turn to the next I lose that access, then this can be devastating for your economy. Tools, I'm importing 2,500 units. And of course tools are essential for a lot of different things. What is my balance on tools? We have to look it up. We have to scroll through and find it. So I've already got a deficit in tools. And then if I happen to lose those imports for whatever reason, then that's going to impact everything else. Now in Victoria 2, if you have a deficit of something, but you have that good available in your stockpile, then you can weather the storm, at least in the short term, and continue to produce whatever goods you're producing, at least in the short term. But this isn't possible in Vic 3, and this is why your economy can collapse from one week to the next. If you have some critical good that's involved in a lot of different things, and if you're relying on imports, and then your imports go away, coal, wood, sulfur, iron especially, even if you lose access to second-tier resources like explosives, like fertilizer, tools, steel, if you lose access to these, it can throw your entire market into disarray. That's because in Vic 2, the stockpile acts as a buffer. If there is a minor disruption, you can overcome that disruption. But because there are no stockpiles in Vic 3, the disruptions are immediate and potentially catastrophic. If you're not micromanaging your trade and resources on a week-by-week basis, then you might not even realize this is happening, and then all of your factories have just basically shut down and emptied because they aren't getting the one critical good that they need. This is a problem with the production methods. Let's say, as an example, you have chemical plants and you're using brine electrolysis, which uses coal, electricity, and sulfur. And if you are importing all of your sulfur and you lose access to it, then this doesn't default to a fertilizer factory, it just becomes a useless brine electrolysis factory. And it's because your RGOs and your factories don't update themselves to take advantage of the situation as it currently is. So if you lose access to goods, your entire industry can grind to a halt immediately. If you check the different production methods, you can see the substitution effects. The engine knows which of these outputs is going to at least make the most money, if not be the most efficient. So I can assume there's an explosive shortage right now. And there's a shortage of 1.5k. So if I try to overcome that shortage by not using so many explosives, then maybe this is a better option. You don't know that unless you go through and manually check them yourself. Now, if you don't care about the amount of money, that's fine. Like me personally, I care more about the outputs, so I'm fine with a bit of a deficit, but I have to be aware of the fact that this deficit exists. Because if I continue to build, let's say, iron mines, and each iron mine is using explosives, then my explosives deficit is just going to get larger and larger until the point that all of my RGOs shut down. And so it's this constant trade-off where you have to balance your inputs, your outputs, and what sort of strain you're willing to put up with. Steam donkeys, for example. Steam donkeys free up a lot of pops, but they take coal and engines. So if you have a coal shortage, now you've got some problems. So I do have a coal shortage. It's not very much for this stage of the game, but it is something I have to be mindful of, because if I just keep spamming out RGOs that aren't coal mines, then I'm going to lose coal. This coal requirement applies to every single RGO that is a mine if you're using steam donkeys. And if you want to see the effect on any individual RGO, you can. You have to look at the production lens, say resources, and you mouse over iron mines. You see exactly how much additional consumption you're going to have for one level. But you have to look at it down here, because if you mouse over it on the left, here in the buildings tab, this only shows you the totals for the current RGO production that you have. So this shows you the consumption for a level 9 iron mine, but it doesn't show you the contribution of a single level of iron mine, which you see down here. If you're going into the game and you are simply setting everything to the max level possible, it's not necessarily the best option, because you might be causing additional deficits of things that maybe you aren't planning for or able to overcome. So the amount of micro necessary to try and balance your economy, and remember, your economy updates on a week-by-week basis. So you have to manage this and keep it under control week to week. And a big part of the reason why is the lack of stockpiles. If you have a deficit and you have a stockpile, then the deficit comes out of the stockpile. If you have a deficit with no stockpile, then the deficit is immediate and affects everything. This is a bit of a problem in my opinion. One sort of funny consequence of this that I realized is that if you have a unit and that unit requires resources, this unit requires the same resources every single week. Because if this unit doesn't get the resources from one week to the next, then it no longer has the resources. You can imagine this trench infantry unit from Veracruz, and at the end of the week he throws his gun away. And if he doesn't have a brand new gun given to him at the beginning of the next week, then he doesn't have a gun, because every week he throws his gun away. This is just one example, of course, but I'm pretty sure I mentioned in designing Vic-3 that you should be able to upgrade the arms that apply to your units. And, you know, like Hoy, you don't have to resupply your weapons every single week or month or day or whatever. There is some turnover rate, so you do have to supply some weapons, but you don't have to resupply the entire army's entire stockpile of guns and artillery every single week like you do in Victoria 3. If we look at another example, let's say textile mills, sewing machines. This take tools, fabric, and dye. But every single week they throw out all of their sewing machines, and if they don't have brand new sewing machines at the beginning of the next week, then they're not going to be sewing anything. You're not using the tools in the sewing, you're using the tools to do the sewing. The tools facilitate the sewing. But if you don't have brand new sewing machines every single week, then you're not going to be sewing anything. If you have a tool shortage, they don't automatically default down to dye workshops or hand sewn. They just become empty textile mills that don't produce anything. So I guess if you take all of that together, the economy and trade system as it applies to individual goods is amazing, but the fact that you have to manage it on a week-by-week basis means that there is a ton of micro involved, and you have to be watching this like a hawk if you don't want your economy to collapse from one week to the next, because you never know when an AI is just going to randomly embargo you and then crash your economy. But if you're willing to do the micro, this becomes the game. This is the gameplay loop in Vic-3 as far as I'm concerned. Check the markets, find out your deficits, check to see what other deficits you have, things like taxation capacity and low market access, and then adjust your constructions to account for those deficits. And then as the construction is complete, check to see how that affects your deficits. Check the deficits, address the deficits. Check the deficits, address the deficits. Check the deficits, address the deficits. Just one week after the next. And this is the gameplay loop in Vic-3 as far as I'm concerned. So this takes probably 80% of my time, and everything else that I do is sort of shoved in between. And this is another great example from this campaign in particular. So I'm playing Mexico, and I'm trying to build up in the early game, trying to get to the point where I can actually even try to take on the US. 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, I am doing nothing but focusing on the economy and trying to min-max my way to victory. And what happens in the meantime? So I'm focusing 100% of my effort over on these three things: deficits and meeting the deficits. And what happens? I get a little tiny pop-up that the US has started a diplomatic play, and I don't even notice it. This is an instance where I did save scum, re-rolled the game, because I was so intent on focusing on the industry that I didn't realize the US was about to invade me. And then, of course, I get the giant pop-up that says the US declared war on you, and I'm like, where did this come from? Out of nowhere, because the game didn't really indicate to me that I was the focus of a diplomatic play. Now, of course, if I'd been focusing over here, I would have seen it, but there are so many pop-ups and things happening over here, and especially over in this corner where there's all the spam taking place, where I'm not paying attention to it. And so I'm over here, markets, 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 deficits, resources, and then I'm getting declared on. I don't even realize it. So at that point, I Control-Alt-Delete, get out of the game, and then reload it to just before the war starts, and then I can actually surrender the war, in which case I only lose a single state instead of losing all of my states. So that's how I manage the early game. And this didn't happen once, this didn't happen twice, this happened 3 times. 3 times I was so engrossed over here, because this is the gameplay in Vic-3, that is looking at markets, addressing the markets, looking at markets, addressing the markets, that I didn't even notice I was being invaded. If I am expanding elsewhere, of course, that takes my focus when I'm expanding. But once I expand, this just becomes a means to an end. So the gameplay is the markets, and then the expansion and the warfare just facilitates the expansion of the markets. This is very different from Vic 2. In Vic 2, I am very hands-off about the economy. I set it up, I get it working, and then I leave it alone and I let it do its thing. But in Vic 3, you can't do that. There is no way for your capitalists or your aristocrats or even the factories themselves to expand your factories on their own. If this factory exists and has cash resources, you can set it to allow auto expansion. Where's that? There it is. So you can set this to auto expand, and your factories will auto expand if they meet the requirements. But even if they are auto expanding, this isn't at the expense of the factory itself. So it still has to go into your production queue. So you're still using your own production to expand your factories and RGOs, even if you tell them to automatically expand. This is very strange, and it's also incredibly slow, and it's a bit nonsensical when it comes to the individual constructions, which we'll talk about in a minute. Many people have pointed out that basically what you're playing is a command economy, regardless of who you're playing. So I'm playing Mexico, I could be playing the US, I could be playing anyone, but I decree that there will be an additional textile mill in Texas. And so I choose where it goes, and then I build it. There's the capitalists in your country have zero agency at this point, so they can't just decide to open one themselves, like they could in Victoria 2. But this applies to every single factory, every single RGO, every single building of any kind, really. And that is, you have to micromanage the constructions, and then you also have to micromanage the production methods. And so this is the game at this point. It's very different from Victoria 2. You can't just set a laissez-faire and then let the economy handle itself. You have to micromanage everything, and this is what I consider an obvious problem. Forced micromanagement in the economy is not only a problem as far as gameplay, but it's also a problem as far as the game concepts. So interventionism versus state capitalism versus laissez-faire, these should handle very differently when you come to your buildings, constructions, and how you manage things. And you know, even the individual factories should be able to set their own production methods based on what goods they have available and what's going to make them the most money, unless you're playing a strict command economy. Realistically, a factory should be able to set its own production methods based on the goods it has available. But of course that's not happening because you are forced to micromanage every single factory and RGO that you have in the world. I am willing to do this, but I don't enjoy doing this. This is the core of the gameplay at this point as far as I'm concerned, and it works, but it's not ideal. In Vic 2, as far as I'm concerned, the economy is a means to an end. And so once you have it set up and it's working properly, then you can be hands-off, and that's fine, but you can never be hands-off in Vic 3. And I have to assume that at some point this will be changed, because this is the sort of obvious change that I mentioned, but at least right now it's got some problems. 80% of my time managing the economy, and then if I do happen to go to war, the second the war is over, I go back to managing the economy non-stop. This is not the sort of gameplay that I would like to be doing in a Victoria game. This is the sort of gameplay that is nice to have as an option, but it's not the sort of gameplay that I want to have forced on me in a Victoria game. Like I said, in Vic 2, I set up the economy and then I'm hands off because I'm focusing on other things. But in this game, I can't focus on the other things because I'm spending all of my time focusing on the economy. So some level of automation is essential. I know it's going to be coming because it's so incredibly obvious, but at least as the game is right now, it's an incredible system that they set up, but just the fact that you're forced to micromanage it, that's the problem. And we know that the AI can micromanage its own economy because it's doing that right now. So using the same system that the AI uses to manage its economy and then just allowing the player to use that same exact system, that would be a huge improvement. But let's talk about constructions. Constructions seem to take the Hoi 4 industrial capacity approach, which is that you have your essentially civilian factories, and then your civilian factories build everything else. This is a little strange, especially back in the 19th century. So why is my level 20 construction sector in Mexico building something in Colorado? I don't know, it's a little strange. Let's look at this construction center, figure out exactly what it is. The construction center itself is using iron, wood, tools, and fabric in this case, because I haven't continued to upgrade it because I just can't afford to use steel. The steel is way too expensive for Mexico. So we're using iron, and we are using laborers exclusively. So these are in fact the people constructing the buildings. These aren't the people planning the buildings. These are the actual workers building the buildings. Why is my construction capacity in the state of Mexico impacting my production in Uruguay. Makes no sense. It's not great. I understand that it is the Hoy system. In this era, it doesn't really fit. If I'm going to build something in Uruguay, it makes more sense that the method of constructing whatever is being constructed should be confined to Uruguay at this point. Now the resources can come in, the wood, the iron, the tools, the fabric, that can all come into Uruguay via trade, but it doesn't make sense that the people are coming from Mexico all the way to Uruguay to build it for you. So the construction really needs to be more distributed in this case, and also consider what the construction represents. So if I build a coal mine in Costa Rica, and look at buildings construction, we see this can take 15 weeks. Almost 4 months to set up a coal mine. If we mouse over the RGO resource building, we see that it's taking tools, engines, explosives, and transportation. So the actual mining is happening once it's built. So my question is, what's happening during this 4 months that the coal mine is being set? So the maximum level of coal mines in Costa Rica is 24, which presumably means this has already been prospected. So we don't have to guess whether there's coal here, we already know that there's coal here. Each level of construction sector requires 5,000 people. So your 5,000 people come here to build something that takes them 4 months. My question is, what are you building that's taking you 4 months? Because it's already been prospected and you're not the one doing the mining. So you're not using the explosives, you're not building the rail lines. What are you building in these 4 months? If you're building a 19th century era coal mine, what is that? It's sort of a warehouse, it's a processing facility, right? The mining itself builds the mine because you mine as you tunnel, so you aren't building the tunnel, you're building the infrastructure to handle what comes out of the tunnel. So it's basically a warehouse at this point. Why is the warehouse taking 5,000 people 4 months to build? Is it 100 people working and 4,900 of them are sitting around drinking coffee? I don't know. So it's not only that your construction is distributed across the entire nation, which doesn't make sense, but also the constructions take an incredibly long time. This makes a lot more sense if you're building a factory, but when it comes to RGOs, it really doesn't. There's a logging camp. Okay, we'll build a logging camp. How long is it going to take to set up this logging camp? It's going to take 2 months. So it's going to take 2 months to construct a logging camp. And this isn't a lumber mill, it's a logging camp. One of the really nice illustrations when you load Victoria 3, one of the loading screens, there's a depiction of workers building a railroad viaduct. This looks very much like the sort of viaduct that a logging company would build, and these go up very quickly. They don't take weeks to build, and when they are being built, they are often built the logging companies themselves, because logging companies constructed temporary rail lines to go into those places where they would harvest the lumber. They built these super rickety rail bridges that work. They're not built to withstand the elements for a super long time, just long enough to harvest the wood, get it out, and then move on to the next area. That exact sort of construction that's being depicted in the loading screen is something that the logging company handles. This is not something that the construction crew coming in to create the logging camp is going to be building. This is something that the logging company is going to be building. What are these 5,000 people sitting around doing for 2 months in construction of the logging camp? It's not literally 5,000 people, but that's just how they represent it in the game. But it's the 8 weeks that's the problem. It's not the 5,000 people. It's the 8 weeks that is the problem. You have these constructions taking place, and they take an eternity. And so you have to build tons of construction centers if you want to get through your constructions in a reasonable amount of time. And then, of course, you have the issue of your centralized construction impacting construction across your entire nation. And the net effect of this, if you consider the markets as a whole, you have your markets updating week to week. You're trying to overcome your deficits, but it's going to take months and potentially years for your constructions to finish to meet demand. This is not great. In Victoria 2, in your factories, you can queue up all of your upgrades simultaneously if you want, and they will in fact upgrade simultaneously if you have the resources necessary. So you can stockpile, steel, whatever else you need, machine parts, and then just upgrade everything, and they all upgrade at the same time. But you can't do that in this game because your constructions are constrained by your construction mana, and so there's a finite number of constructions that you can do at one time. They're not constrained to the places where the construction points are being derived from, which is very strange. The industrial capacity system from Hoy, I don't mind on its own. It's a little strange, but I don't mind it. The real problem is that the constructions take forever. And even something as simple as just upgrading a factory or an RGO a single level. Let's take a wheat farm as an example. How long is this going to take? It's going to take 8 weeks to do what? To clear the land, I guess. Is it going to take 5,000 people 8 weeks to clear a 19th century era wheat farm? No, they're going to do this in like an afternoon. But in this game, you have to wait 2 months. So this is not great. And especially because the impacts to your economy are instantaneous, but you have to wait weeks and months and potentially years if you have multiple constructions queued up. So this is not great. At the very least, the construction times need to be tightened way up. This is just a standard RGO. This is the most basic sort of resource that you can have. Why is it taking 8 weeks to get it ready? If you're looking at factories, this makes a lot more sense. So sure, factories can take a long time to set up, but RGOs, no, they should be nearly instantaneous. It's because the RGOs take so long to set up that it takes so long to set up everything else, because if you're setting up RGOs, you have to get through these constructions before you can get to your industrial construction. So these taking a long time makes sense. These taking a long time makes no sense. Why is it taking 2 months to build a fishing wharf? This should literally be like a week at most. So I guess that's the take home. At the very least, RGOs should be way faster to build, and ideally the construction should be distributed in some way. You could do it like in Victoria 2, where every single RGO and industry can have one level of construction occurring at a time. So let's say you queue up 5 levels of livestock ranches, and so the first one would be the only one to proceed, and then the second it's done, the second one could start. That would make a lot of sense. So you do one level at a time, so you queue up as many as you want, but it's only going to do one at a time. That would be perfect. If that's too fast, you could also have a restriction on a per state level, so you can only have maybe one construction occurring at a time in a state. That would also make sense, but it would really slow things down. But the simultaneous construction of multiple levels based on industrial capacity in other parts of your country is the part that doesn't really make sense. But as with the RGOs in the factories, being able to set this to some level of automation where the AI can come in and determine what is going to be built, the AI already has the capacity to do this. Because if you look at any particular RGO, you can sort by profit impact, and then you can see which ones are going to be the most favorable and the most valuable. And so the AI could pick out those particular factories and RGOs and just build them. And that would be a really great system. So less time having to stare at your markets and buildings. Now for this next point, I've pulled up my first Hungary campaign. This was the one that I streamed and then continued. And before I get to the point I want to talk about, can we appreciate Russian Constantinople, Russian Albania, Russian Central Africa, Russian Southwestern Africa, and Russian South America? I'm fully on board for this. And of course Russian Northern Japan, can't forget that. So I don't know why this save exists, because it shouldn't exist. This was an Iron Man campaign, but somehow the cloud managed to save a snapshot. And you can see where I'm expanding. And what basically had happened in this campaign is that I passed a reform, and this reform pissed off the landowners. You can see they're already at -12, so this clearly is before I passed whatever reform it was. There are a lot of things that I wasn't familiar with in the government system, but you know, I wanted to pass a law, and it pissed off the landowners, and that was the key here. As far as the political strength, they don't have a lot of power. It's only 12.1%. I'm not even really sure where to find how many of them there are, but, you know, just assuming it's the landowners, not the people working the land, how big can this group be, right? I figured, what the hell? I knew that whatever law it was going to radicalize them, but I was like, whatever, I'll just deal with it, because it's a tiny group, right? Well, wrong. This entire chunk of Hungary down here, basically everything south of the original borders, rebelled simultaneously. And so, you know, it's like, what's the worst that could happen? It's like, literally lose everything. Okay, so that's annoying, but what was the bigger problem? It's that whenever you have a rebellion plays out like a diplomatic play. You can't just immediately go to war and try to re-annex it. You have to sit there while the diplomatic play plays out. It's happening, though, in a game where your markets update week to week. And so you've just lost access to half of your markets, and so your industry is completely screwed. Now, if you had something in the stockpile, that would alleviate some of the issue, but that's just the first problem. The second problem is that the game heavily encourages deficit spending, and so that's how I grow my economies. I'm about a fourth of the way to the debt ceiling, but at the time this rebellion happened, I was halfway to the debt ceiling. I was funding constructions like crazy, expanding all over the place, expanding constructions everywhere, and I was taking on a lot of debt in this calculated manner. And then what happened? Because I had this rebellion, my debt ceiling changed. I went from being at 50% of my debt ceiling to being at like 99% of my debt ceiling, literally right at it. So I'm stuck in a diplomatic action. I can't do anything until it cycles through. But while I'm waiting, my economy has collapsed because I have no stockpile, and I am bankrupt instantly because I carry all of the debt. And so what happens next? Slovakia, which I'd retaken this, I'm pretty sure at the time, but basically Slovakia instantly rebels. Transylvania instantly rebels. And I've seen this happen to other nations, and I think this is why. And it's that you end up in a sort of debt spiral, and it's because once you have one rebellion, your industry collapses. If you have any debt, you get saddled with all of it, and then you instantly go bankrupt. And then as a result of going bankrupt, your unrest goes through the roof, and then everyone rebels. Now, is that necessarily a bad thing? I don't know. It really depends on your take, I suppose. But at the very least, the problem that the rebellion is a diplomatic action. This is the core of the entire issue, because you can't possibly re-annex the land in the diplomatic action until either you've won the war, or the AI decides it's just not going to rebel because of the diplomatic action. And if it's going to be an obvious war anyway, then you might as well just start fighting it on day one. But you can't, though in the meantime your country falls apart. This is a major problem, and it also gets to some other issues with diplomatic plays. Every single war in Victoria 3 plays out like a crisis in Victoria 2. That's fine for a lot of wars, but it does create some problems where random nations can intervene in just about anything because they have holdings all across the globe. UK especially, but really anyone who has interest in whatever area you're in can intervene in any war at any time for any reason. It does seem that the restrictions on joining a diplomatic play are the same as those that restrict a nation from enforcing white peace in Victoria 2. As an example, when I was playing Mexico, I would wait until Great Britain was at war, and I would wait until the US was at war, and then when the two of them were at war, I could safely try and expand without having to fear either one of them intervening. I don't know if that's 100%, but at least that's been my experience. There are situations where you should be able to go to war without having to go through a diplomatic play, and rebellions are the easiest example of that. There's no reason why I should have to negotiate with the people trying to break away, especially in cases where it's more easier to crush them. So, you know, some small rebellion like part of Slovakia, like why wouldn't I just crush that instantly instead of having to wait for the negotiations? And if there are negotiations, then other countries can of course intervene, so this only ever hurts you. Of course, there's also the issue that if you are in a diplomatic play and either side capitulates, then it's only the first war goal that gets imposed. That's why, as Mexico, it's how you can prevent the US from taking all of your land so quickly. But really, you should be able to set the limits of your ultimatum, so you should be able to set multiple conditions in order to even accept the capitulation. It shouldn't just be for one state. I'm pretty sure I mentioned that in designing Vic 3. You should be able to threaten for any number of things. Of course, negotiations are fine, but really you should be able to set that ultimatum to include any number of things and not just a single war goal. On the topic of diplomatic plays, I know there are problems with this system, and usually what ends up happening right now is that when you win a war, you've done it simply by pushing the enemy to -100 war support, and so they just capitulate to everything. The AI almost never wants to peace out for whatever you're asking for, and that's just because the negative modifiers are so incredibly high. But you can see what the modifiers are, so even if we're not asking for anything, just a white peace is -110. And part of this is the short duration of the war, but also the war support. That's going to be a huge part of it. It depends on a lot of different factors, but in my experience, if I'm going for land especially, it's very rare that I've been able to impose my war goals without driving the enemy to -100 war support. But what is something that is present here that no one seems to have recognized? So what is possible up here? Number one, we can impose our war goals, which the US will not accept. Number two, we can accept the US's war goals, which of course they will accept. Third option is white peace, which right now they won't accept. What is the fourth option? The fourth option is a bilateral peace deal. This is in fact something super important that I asked for in designing Vic 3, and it is here. It's not something that's practically useful as of yet, because it's not something that the AI is going to accept, but it is something that's possible, and so that's very important as far as I'm concerned. A lot of very obvious things missing from wars right now, like the ability to add war goals during an active war, but also just the ability to negotiate additional things here that should be possible, like various types of concessions, things that I mentioned in designing Victoria 3. But just the fact that this is here, this is massively important as far as I'm concerned. Right now, it's not particularly useful, especially in single player, but I imagine this will be expanded upon, and especially if you can add additional means of negotiating, this is super important. and especially when it comes to multiplayer. This will allow you to conclude single wars in ways that are negotiated without having to simply do the unilateral peace deals like you had before. So super important and a massive improvement over really any of the other Vic games. And hopefully we get the same sort of system when it comes to negotiating deals in the diplomacy window. Now, as far as diplomacy, there have been some major expansions, and many of these are things that I specifically asked for in designing Victoria 3. So I would say on the whole, the diplomatic systems are improving over what they were in Victoria 2. There's still a lot of work to be done. Of course, one of the obvious issues is that if you have a customs union, then basically what is the equivalent of your sphere member can just be snatched away from you, and there's nothing you can do about it. So, you know, there are problems. But I would say that this allows you to do a lot more than the things that you could do in Victoria 2. So I think things are moving in the right direction when it comes to diplomacy, even if some aspects of it are flawed right now. I'm not super concerned about the obvious problems because the obvious problems have obvious solutions. And of course there are plenty of other issues that are more or less pressing depending on your priorities, but at least for me those are the most important issues. Without trying to make this video 3 hours long, I think this is a good place to end it. The last thing I wanted to mention was in regard to multiplayer. Now, I haven't played a multiplayer game of Victoria 3, and I really have no desire to at this point. I watched Spudgun's multiplayer game and I saw how that played out. And after what I've experienced in single player and what I've seen about multiplayer, and I'm not even talking about the crashes and instability issues, the play style in Victoria 3, the gameplay loop, which is build markets, build markets, build markets, build markets. This doesn't really seem to encourage the sort of interactions that I would like to be engaged in a Victoria game, or even like EU4 or something like that. In my opinion, the game as it is right now favors three specific types of multiplayer. One is single player multiplayer, where you're playing a multiplayer game but everyone's just kind of doing their own thing. I'm not super interested in that, so that's not the kind of game that I want to play. The next kind of game that it encourages is the meme game, where everyone's intervening in everyone's wars for no reason, for any reason, and there's no reason not to because no one can add war goals during wars. So you can literally just join any war and screw anyone over at any time for any reason and then laugh about it. And that is also not the kind of game that I'm interested in, but I can certainly understand if people are. The third type of multiplayer game that this encourages is the one that really uses your people skills. It's actually the RP game. There was a roleplay group that I played with a long time ago. I don't know if they're still around. It's called Blood and Eisen, and they did super involved roleplay sessions of Victoria 2 that involved writing massive text walls in role-playing between sessions. And that's just not my style. That's not what I'm interested in. But what this game currently allows would be perfect for a group like that, because if you're just spending your time negotiating the diplomatic plays and you're actually role-playing it, then that's great. But if you're trying to play the skill-based strategic game that a lot of Vic 2 games revolve around, then I don't see that this is really the game for that right now. And I hope it will become that game, but right now I just don't see it as being that kind of game. Now, if this game, as it is, fits your multiplayer style, that's great. For me, this is not an ideal multiplayer game, unfortunately. But I'm hoping that with the inevitable changes that will be coming, I'm hoping that it will become a game that's more suitable for that sort of strategic multiplayer, the kind that a lot of people really enjoy in Victoria 2. For single player, I'm okay with the min-maxing, I'm okay with pausing it and resetting my markets constantly, but trying to do this while the game is running in real time and you can't even focus on anything else, that's just not my idea of a good time. Of course, automation will greatly help with that, but anyway, that's the last of it. So, I'm not going to say the game's great, I'm not going to say it's terrible. It's okay, it needs a lot of work. Some things are great, some things are not so great, but I'm hoping that over the course of the next couple of years, it becomes a really fantastic game. So I'm still hopeful. Yeah, that's it. That's the end of the video. And thanks for watching. Have a good one.